Welcome to the Data Science Hangout. If you're joining for the first time, I'm Rachel, and it's great to meet you. If this is your first Hangout, this is an open space for the whole data science community to connect and chat about data science leadership, questions you're facing, and what's going on in the world of data science. You all have probably heard me say that a lot of times now. These sessions are recorded and shared to YouTube as well. Also on the Data Science Hangout site. So you can always go back and rewatch or find helpful resources shared there too. We always want to create spaces where everybody can participate and we can hear from everyone. So there's 3 ways that you can ask questions today and jump in. You can raise your hand on the Zoom chat so I can call on you. You could put questions in the Zoom chat and feel free to just put a little star next to your question if you want me to read it out loud instead. But we also have a Slido link that Tyler or Hannah will share in just a moment in the chat. So you can ask questions anonymous, or both of you at the same time. You can ask questions anonymously too if you don't want to be part of the recording. But just love to reiterate, we really want to hear from everyone, no matter your level of experience or the area of work too. But with all of that, I'm so excited to be joined by my co-hosts for today, Alice Walsh. Alice is VP of Translational Research at Pathos. And Alice, I'd love to just have you maybe introduce yourself and a little bit about the work that you do to get us going.
Yeah, absolutely. And let me know if you have any problems hearing me. I had a yogurt related microphone incident before this started, so I'm hoping that everything is going to be good. Yeah, so thank you so much, Rachel, for having me. As mentioned, I'm Alice. I live here outside of Philadelphia, where I work in drug development. And I think there's probably been, I don't know, I'd be curious to hear on this call, how many people do pharma or research related activities, because it's an interesting area because pharma development has always been very data rich, right? There's always been biostats teams who are involved in analyzing clinical trials and all that sort of stuff. And what I do is I'm involved much earlier in the process. So I've worked with everything from drug discovery teams who do target identification, like what should we even make a drug for, all the way through to drugs that are in registrational trials, like big phase 3 studies. And we're trying to understand more around what are the patients that are responding to drugs and benefiting from drugs versus those patients who aren't. So I would describe myself as training in computational biology. So I have a couple degrees in engineering, bioengineering, biological engineering, and I got into drug development because I was really interested in working in patient data. So I did a PhD where we did some really interesting projects where at University of Pennsylvania, you could work with a neurosurgeon and get access to brain cancer samples. And I thought oh, wow, this is so amazing. I can look at 20 patients. And then I interviewed with people in the pharmaceutical industry and they were like, oh, we have 1,000 patients. I was like, oh my God, that's amazing. I want to do that. I want to work with patient data and I want to try to understand, what does disease mean at a molecular level? And how could we use that information to make smarter drugs or to identify the patients that really should take our drugs? So I can say a little bit about where I've worked and things. I've worked at Janssen. I worked at Bristol Myers Squibb. So those are 2 of the largest pharmaceutical companies where I was doing biomarker type work, leading teams who are working on those different aspects of drug development. And so then most recently, now I work at a startup company. So it's the complete opposite of working at a giant company where you have lots of infrastructure and IT and things like that. So I moved over to oncology therapeutic startup where I was employee number 2. And so now we have 5 people. We're growing to 10 people. So it's really exciting to be part of a company where we're starting from scratch.
Awesome. What's been the biggest change in moving from a big company to a startup, other than the infrastructure and all that?
I have a lot fewer meetings. I don't know. I've talked to people before about oh, what's it like day to day, in a big company? And I'm well, if you like having 13 meetings a day, it's fantastic. Which I'm a people person. I like talking to people. So I actually didn't really mind having 9 to 5. Here's a meeting here, here's a meeting there. It's a very dynamic environment. But it is difficult if you really need to put your head down and do a lot of critical thinking. And so I was doing all my thinking time in my car, driving between the office and the house. And now I work from home and I don't have that time, but I just have a lot more non-meeting time to like do some thinking, strategizing, come up with crazy ideas, all that sort of stuff. So that's the biggest difference, fewer meetings, because when there's only 4 people at a company, it's really hard to talk to them all day. By definition, the math doesn't work to have like 13 meetings a day.
Yeah, definitely. I was actually going to wait to ask this question, but because you just said a lot of your thinking happened in driving to work and now you switched to remote work. I know something you are interested in is optimizing remote work and remote teams. So curious to just hear a bit about your thoughts on that. Or what you're facing.
Yeah, no, I was thinking about that a lot. Like this weekend, I went for a bike ride and I was having all these like ideas when I probably should have been like paying attention to not getting hit by a car or something. But yeah, now I have like all the good ideas come like on the treadmill, on the bike, in the shower. Like I don't have the car time. And I guess also I probably should have been doing like a lot of thinking in the car when I was supposed to be paying attention to the road. But yeah, no, I would love to talk to people about how they're doing remote work well, especially for data teams, right? Like if I think about the types of interactions that I'm having, like you don't necessarily want to like make a big slide deck to explain something to a colleague or a coworker. So like communicating effectively when all you have is like Slack huddles and like Zoom meetings and all those sorts of things is a challenge. Before I joined this startup, I was remote working as well to some extent, right? So thanks to the pandemic, but even without the pandemic, I was on a team where I had direct reports in Boston, New Jersey, and San Francisco. So we were already like a distributed team and we were working with people in Spain. So we were working across like I don't know how many hour time zone, which is like an interesting challenge, but I would love to hear how other people are optimizing for that, because I just feel like there's got to be a better way. Like people have got to learn something in the last 2 years of pandemic about how to do remote work really, really well.
Yeah, I'd love to open it up to everyone if you have thoughts or want to share anything in the chat too.
I can share about what I just posted, which is about the book Rest by Alex Pang. So Rest is, if you haven't read it, you should totally go read it. It's fantastic. It gives lots of different accounts of different people. Lots of them are scientists. Some of them are technology people. And it's accounts kind of all throughout history of famous scientists who used their downtime to do their background brain work, right? Like the walking around on campus or the mountain climbing or the whatever that they did was like really essential to the background brain processes that they needed to have ideas and think and all of that stuff. I've been working remotely since 2015, and I feel like I was not very good at it for a long time, but I had a director at one point who was like, I need you to like take 15-minute walks during your day. It's like, bill them as hours. They're billable hours. This is part of you working for this client. I need you to go take walks. And that really helped, like building that into your schedule so that you have the white space to let your brain do background work is really important. Otherwise, you just sit there and you're at your screen for longer than a couple of hours and your brain stops doing all that background process work because you're forcing it to do too much, stuff that's in front of your face.
I love that. A really good recommendation. I'm going to check out this book.
It's really
I
good.
see Ravonda, you also put some thoughts into the chat too, if you want to jump in.
Sure. I would like to get any advice on how we can work to make brainstorming more work better virtually, because it seems like that is an area where people are so excited to get out of meetings when they're virtual. If anyone has any ideas about how to improve on that process, that would be great.
I can say a couple things. Sorry, I just saw in the chat too, someone said, get a dog. Don't get a dog, because I'm just looking at my dog whining at me from like outside in the other room. They're not good. The brainstorming thing is the one that I've been trying out a couple things. Like there are online platforms like Mural, and probably like I've used a couple other ones where you can like drag around stickies and you can like everybody can kind of collaborate on like this big whiteboard together. I found that those can be like difficult to use, but some of the concepts are useful. So like in my team, we've done brainstormings where we just use Google Slides. And basically like to prepare for the brainstorming, I do some prep work around like, here are the like high level, like what if questions that we're trying to get ideas around. And then like have everybody go off and do their own brainstorming on separate slides. So like, it's really low tech. Like I'll be like, here's your slide, here's your slide, here's your slide. And everybody write down like as many ideas as they can. And it's like the no bad ideas kind of concept. And then after like 10 or 15 minutes of everybody doing individually and not looking at each other's ideas, then we come back together and we try to move them around to like categorize them. So like we say like, okay, it looks like there's actually like 5 ideas here. And so let's start a new slide for each of those ideas and everybody can like move their ideas around. So you can see how some tools where you can like really like drag and drop stuff would be great, but Google Slides is a very low tech way to get the same effect. And then you can start to build on people's ideas like, okay, yeah, great idea to do this, but what if we also did this other thing and pulled it together? So I've actually been really excited about the brainstorming that I can do online. I think that's actually maybe one of the places where like everybody calling in is kind of like a great equalizer. Because I know I have colleagues and things who aren't going to like stand up and say like, let me take over the whiteboard and tell you all my great ideas. They might sit back in a meeting, but when you give everybody their own slide, people are really happy to like quietly like fill out their own ideas and put things there. It kind of like levels the playing field.
I like that, especially the part about giving everyone their own slide, because I've noticed in some meetings, people who are a little bit more introverted may feel a little bit more shy at online meetings, at least in my experience. So I like the idea that everyone has at least a small space. And I like the idea of brainstorming separately and then kind of coming together collectively. I like that a lot. Thank you.
Yeah, and then you have the document too as a record, right? It's shared with everybody and you can like, I don't know, I guess I'm trying to think if there's other platforms that this works well for. I'm just realizing that like my previous job where we use like Microsoft, I don't know how, I can't remember if you can like actively all edit the same PowerPoint. I think so, it's the same idea. But yeah.
So I see Mark, you suggested Zoom's whiteboard feature too, if you want to share that or how that works. I don't know why I've never tried that out before.
We should try it out now, it's fun.
It is pretty nifty. You can just write on like the screen. So if you need like a true, well, hang on. It's been actually a while since I've used it. I can't recall if you can just write directly on the screen or if there is like a true whiteboard. I think it gives you the option of either. But I've used it sparingly since I've started. My team has started coming back into the office more often. But I found that that's been helpful when we were like walking through some technical topics that like needed like a quick just like hand sketch. It's kind of wonky to do it with a mouse, but it's better than trying to describe something visual to someone.
Cool. I love this topic of brainstorming too. George, I see you put some thoughts in the chat too, if you want to jump in.
Hey, yeah. No, I was just saying on top of the walking. I know Elizabeth mentioned billable walks, which I think is great, and I've worked at consultancy where you would definitely encourage to include thinking time, which was great. But it doesn't have to be a walk. It's anything where you get rid of your screens for a minute. So I always have notepads in front of me. So I'm like writing most of my ideas, and then I end up, because we do a lot of work on Slack, half of my messages are just a photo of a whiteboard or a photo of a sheet where I'm like, I've written all this stuff down and I want to put it in a document, but I don't have time or whatever, so I just send it to someone else and they end up having to deal with messy content. So I'm probably a nightmare to work with, but I definitely encourage getting away from screens, and the physical act of writing is shown to be really helpful for memory and that sort of thing. It's why you write notes when you're in lectures and that sort of thing. It's not for the content, I don't think, as much as it is for you to get that connection with what you're doing. So yeah, there we go.
Yeah, definitely. And then you're focusing on one thing instead of a million things on your screen at once.
Yeah, and all the pop-ups and notifications that you get. Yeah, it's why I have a smartwatch, but I only wear it for exercise because you can't deal with getting everything all the time, being bugged left, right. Yeah.
Yeah. Maybe shifting gears a little bit, I see there was a Slido message that was, what does your tool stack look like, Alice?
Yeah, that's a great question. Right now, we are pretty easy, right? Like we have a GitHub organization account. We do lots of stuff just like locally in R in our studio, or like Python with VS Code. Everything goes on GitHub. When we need a cloud computer, we use Google Cloud, spin up a VM, use Docker, store our images on the container registry. It's pretty simple because there's like 3 people working together, which is like a huge luxury to be able to do things simply like that. But yeah, like, I guess I think it's kind of fun being at a small company where it's like, if I need to deploy like a Shiny app, like I did this the other day, I was like, okay, I guess I have to figure out how to do that on Google Cloud, because there's nobody, in the company who's like maintaining an RStudio Connect or something, right? I'm like, but I can figure it out, can Google around, deploy that, figure out how to get it to work internally and things like that. I hope that answers the question.
Awesome. Thank you. Let me see what other questions were coming in. One was, what data science conferences do you recommend for industry specific or just in general?
Oh man, that's so hard because I don't think there are good ones. Well, I mean, it's like, I feel like I'm part of like multiple worlds, right? Because like I do a lot of things, like I'm an organizer for Our Ladies Philadelphia. And so I feel like I do a lot of like our general stuff where like, okay, I'm going to go to our studio conference for the first time and those sorts of things, which are very much like general purpose, like our data science type things. But for my job, like the conferences I really go to for that are like, ACR, ASCO, I'm going to bio. They're like very much around like clinical trials and that sort of research. And there's often like a session, which is, I think I kind of talked about this when I was at AACR, they like don't really know what to do with the data science stuff, right? Like there'll be a session which is like genetics and bioinformatics and data science and cheminformatics. And it all kind of just like gets put together in this like semantic soup of data intensive work. Industry wise, though, I will say one thing is EBI, which is like the European Bioinformatics Institute, or okay, I hope that's what it stands for. They organize like an industry consortium, which has always been really fantastic. And so they organize different meetings, which are for people, within their industry partner companies, which are a lot of like pharma and biotech. So they're not open to the public, but those sorts of meetings are extremely valuable because it's a much, much smaller group of people who are working on some of the same challenges and who want to collaborate in kind of a pre-competitive way.
Awesome. I'll put a shameless plug in for the RStudio conference too.
Yeah, we'll plug it while we're here.
I know, Ravanda, you just asked around certain conferences too. Okay, for a second I got paranoid and I turned the chat only to host and co-host, so I can only see the chat, but Ravanda, feel free to unmute yourself too.
Hi, yes, I was wondering if you like the ISMB conferences or the Recom conferences, the ones, because they're kind of more bioinformatics focused, but that seems pretty relevant for data science and oncology.
Yeah, I have to be honest, I haven't been in ages. I haven't been, as I recall, like ISMB used to like rotate, or ISCB, whatever they call it, the conference used to rotate between, it was like in Europe and then be in the US. I feel like I probably haven't been since like 2014. I should go because I think there's a lot of interesting topics at those conferences, but generally the kinds of meetings that I've been going to are much more kind of disease focused. Yeah.
Great.
But they're good meetings.
And I should have explained why I was being paranoid in the chat. Yesterday at a Zoom meetup, we had some not so great people who joined and spammed the chat. So I saw a few people joining with numbers in their names. So I just wanted to make sure we were good. I'll put the chat back open to everyone too. But let's see what other questions were coming in. Someone asked on Slido, Alice, have you experienced a SAS to R transition? If so, what lessons learned did you find that would have been useful to know up front?
I have not. So I've never worked in like a more traditional like biostats in pharma team where they were doing that. I have worked with teams who were like this, we were like an R team and there's like a SAS team and we want to work together. And I do think that that's challenging, right? To have those kinds of collaborations across. And so you kind of have to meet people where they are and like, you know, okay, let's do some stuff in SAS, let's do some stuff in R, let's find a place where we can collaborate together on the code. But no, I have not done that. I've been fortunate enough to be kind of in a more research setting where it was kind of like use whatever tools you want. We had a lot of freedom always to do whatever we wanted, basically.
Hi, I'm Alex. I can maybe chime in a bit about the SAS to R thing.
Yeah, awesome.
Unless someone else had a question they were first in line to answer.
No, that'd be great.
Yeah, so I work at a company where we're all primarily epidemiologists or come from some kind of a research background. And I work in medtech, but basically we were a team that was primarily SAS users. And then we switched over to R, and it was a real, like, it was definitely a challenge. We made the change because of financial reasons, pretty much. But yeah, honestly, I think people are really happy we made the switch. But I think what helped a lot was the R for Data Science book. So I really recommend people read that. And I think when a lot of people who use SAS are coming from this research background, and a lot of data science, I think, is really structured in this more computer science framework. Yeah. And so focusing on the tidyverse and going through R for Data Science and really breaking things down into kind of step-by-step the research process really helped my team get acclimated to R. So that's what we did. We really broke it down by each step of the analytic process, and we kind of went along with the R for Data Science book. And we just looked at, okay, how do we import our data? How do we, get some basic frequencies? I tried to as I was learning it, I tried to compare it using the count function in the tidyverse to using procfreq in SAS. So there was a lot of trying to compare things. And there's also a great online book out there. Sometimes there's maybe too many books for R online, but there's one called the Epidemiologist Handbook for using R. I can share a link, but I thought that was really great for kind of helping my team switch from SAS to R because they really made those comparisons a lot.
Yeah, that'd be great if you could share that link in the chat too. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I feel like that's always a difficult topic, maybe around how much does a team standardize the tools they have people work with, right? I've been interested in this question in the past, right? I worked in a team where it was this person uses Python for this, I use R for that, maybe somebody has a Perl script, and we all kind of did whatever, which has I feel like that has some advantages. It's nice, people can use whatever tool they want and feel very much that they can pick the right tool for the job. When I was at BMS, we basically, everything was in R. It was we're just gonna use R. It helps a lot for collaboration. So everybody, Alex was just saying, everybody's learning together. It actually is building a lot of collaboration, and everybody can then kind of work on the same code. Everybody can share their code, everybody can share their experience. So I also really enjoyed that. I'm sure there were people on the team who were unhappy having to use R if they really wanted to use something else.
Yeah, I think that definitely happened on our team. We kept the SAS license just to keep, to make the transition easier. But I have found that once people started using R, they actually really enjoyed the flexibility that came with it. But yeah,
Yeah.
there definitely was some pushback.
Thank you, Alexander. I don't want to switch topics too quickly if someone else wanted to jump in on that as well.
Can't find the raise hand thing. I'm happy to jump in again.
Yeah.
Yeah, in terms of a lot of people I deal with, it's slightly more archaic than that. It's a lot of Excel users. So I'm trying to convince them to use data science tools, sort of like showing them the options. And so I work in insurance primarily, which I've mentioned a few times before. But one of the other things that we're competing with, or that I'm competing with as someone who goes around as a sort of R/open source data science specialist, is these big platforms that come in and have really expensive licenses and that sort of thing. It's going to come in, it's going to solve everything. This is the solution. It's sort of like trying to encourage people not. But also it's that mentality of, right, we're going to move everyone from one thing to the other, and it's pushing people there. Whereas one of the things that I try and utilize in my to my advantage is, because it's cheap, we can get this, we can just set up a server, it's really, really cost effective. We can make tools that attract users onto it rather than things where we're pushing people there. And I think it's so important if you want to get the buy-in from everyone. It's like, look, if you want to go and put everything in Excel and deal with all your links that keep breaking and everything that keeps collapsing, go ahead. But we've also got this solution over here that a few people are using now and working, and they're getting loads done and going home at 5. But so do whatever you want. And then with that, I find you can attract and get the conversation flowing a lot more than coming in with a director who says no one's allowed to save stuff in this anymore. I think that's it's difficult to do sometimes, but it's I think it's a good approach. Yeah.
Thank you. I know, Alice, you're about to jump in and say something, so I didn't want to switch gears.
No.
Okay.
No, I mean, it's totally, I agree with that, right? Like getting people to switch tools and things, it's like, what do you go with, the carrot or the stick, right? Like maybe a carrot shaped stick. I don't know. Like I do agree, like it'd be great to incentivize people. At the end of the day, I do think though, depending on like how your organization is structured and stuff, it's extremely helpful if your like senior leadership is also extremely enthusiastic and can push things. A lot of organizations, people get very frustrated trying to drive things from the ground up. It's just like, a lot more downhill if you have a senior leader who can get people excited about it as well.
Yeah, definitely. And on that topic too, I know you're talking about training people onto R or Python, or coming from Excel or coming from SAS. I see somebody asked anonymously, if I want to know how to start doing data science, what resources does everyone have to share?
There's so many.
The flood in chat.
Yeah, exactly. The flood. I feel like we've already got like the big book of R. There's like the classic, like there's R ones, and then there's like broader like data stuff, right? And like maybe, her cookbook. People are gonna like put a ton of stuff in the chat. There's got to be like one master learn data stuff thing. I would say maybe though, my number one thing to say would be find something that you're excited about, right? So a quote I really like is like, the prerequisite for doing exciting work is being excited about it, right? So if you're really excited about cooking or like baseball or cancer research or like marketing, whatever it is, like find something like that you can do a project with. Some of the like intro learning stuff, you still need to do it. But if you have a goal in mind, like, I really want to analyze my Fitbit data or something, that'll make it so much better to learn and get into it. And then you have an interesting like case study or project that you can also use to like demonstrate that you know what's up. So
I love that.
I actually found Twitter to be really helpful for learning about data science stuff. I found like so many resources on there for R. And to be honest, it was kind of overwhelming. So
it's
looking
really
back,
overwhelming.
So looking back, like, I think it was a great place to find things. I think it's also a good idea to like maybe like think about what you're most interested in with doing with data science and just focus on it one thing at a time. Like maybe you really just want to do like visualizations. And I think then maybe you could do the Tidy Tuesday visualizations and you can just focus on that. And I think you'll be surprised how much you can learn just from focusing on one little thing, because even those little things have extra things that come with it. So, so yeah, I don't know. So I think there's a lot of ways to find amazing resources and to learn data science. The hard part is maybe thinking, what do you want to start with first? So that's what I would do.
Yeah.
Great point.
I also agree that there's like a positive like mental reinforcement when you have like some small successes, right? Like there's that like joy of like, I made a plot, like I made a thing and I can like show it to people, I did something. And that really kind of like motivates you to keep going. And I think it helps if it's something that's not like, oh, look, I plotted, you know, like whatever cars, like disc versus horsepower, like who gives a shit? Sorry. Like that's not exciting to most people, right? But if it's your own data and you can say like, look, I plotted my like steps per day or whatever, it's a really exciting, like, I don't know, like what's the right endorphin or whatever that you get from having that you can then build on.
I love all of these links in the chat too. I scrolled up through the chat at one point, Libby, and I saw you had a great question around other skills that help with data science. You want to jump in?
Sure. Let me scroll up and look.
I couldn't find it. Yeah.
Okay. Oh yeah. So I asked if you have any non-data skills or hobbies that you think make you a better data scientist. And I've been thinking about this a lot because I feel like the data science community is really vast and varied. We all have different things we're good at. A lot of us are musicians. A lot of us, I know you and I both sew. Like, do you have any thoughts on that?
Oh my gosh. I could talk about this for like an hour.
Okay, sorry.
I could talk about this for so long.
It's very interesting to me.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And I think like I've been somebody who I've done random projects that are kind of like intersecting with data work as well, right? Like I think even like, you know, I did an analysis several years ago, like I live near Philadelphia. We have Wawa here. So Wawa is like a gas station sandwich company. I don't know. It's I don't know if people know it other places, but like down the road from my house, there was like, they're going to build like a super Wawa, which is like a giant like Wawa with gas. And so all the neighbors were like protesting and everything. And I was like, okay, well, I can do some analysis. I can like pull all the locations for all the Wawa in the country and like analyze like how different is our Wawa from those Wawas, and like bring my skills to the table to my like angry neighbors to be like, you're right, this Wawa sucks. And like, but you know, like it's an example of like, okay, I did something weird because I was interested in the question. But bigger, like I think there's the question of like, what are the soft skills that make like somebody like a good data scientist versus like a great data scientist, which is something I've thought a lot about. And I think people ask like, okay, like what are the skills you need for data science? And I'm like, yeah, the table stakes are you have to come and you have to know some like programming, maybe something about a database, maybe some statistics, and maybe something about like the business you're in. Like, so in my case, having a strong biologic knowledge of, you know, cancer pathways and things is really important. But then there's everything else that makes you like go from good to great. So I tend to think like there's the ability to communicate and build your network to influence people, right? That's super important. I think more though, it's also about creativity. So how do you address problems? And then how do you find the right problem? That's a huge thing. I think that's kind of the difference between being like somebody who does something versus a scientist, is that you're looking for the correct question. So somebody might come to you and say like, here, we're going to do this. So like, make me do this analysis, you know, give me a p-value. But you can come back and say like, actually, I think what we really need is XYZ, this other thing. And I think that's what differentiates people who are just kind of good at their job versus great at their job. Yeah. But I could talk about it forever, because how you develop those skills, I think, are sometimes not from your day job. They're from like the other things that you go out and develop about yourself. You might not actually cultivate those skills in your 9 to 5.
I agree.
It's amazing. Thanks, Alice. And I definitely need to go to a Wawa. Apparently, there's a lot of love
Oh yeah.
for Wawa.
Well, I also like I gave like a lightning talk about like this Wawa, and it was funny because everybody was like, when I started, they were like, yeah, Wawa, it's gonna be this like pro Wawa talk. And I was like, uh-oh, I'm actually very anti-Wawa. I was like, this is the wrong crowd for this. I should have like prefaced like I'm gonna be saying that I don't want the Wawa. So.
I see there was an anonymous question that just came in. I understand averaging for missing values, but where do you stop on deleting data with a lot of NAs?
Ooh. I mean, I think that that's going to depend on your field, right? Like, I'll say in the field that I'm in, like, yeah, I work right now with like observational data. So it's real world data from patients. Like if you're an oncology patient and you go to your oncologist, they'll be collecting all sorts of information about your family history, your current diagnosis, your treatment, your how you're doing on that treatment. And then companies can curate that information for research purposes, right? So they're trying to understand everything they can about real cancer patients today in the real world versus clinical trials, which are kind of a different situation. But in that data, you have a huge issue with missing this, right? Because unlike in a clinical trial where we're going to fill out, we require all this information, you're not going to necessarily get all that information from a patient's medical record, especially if you're curating unstructured data from pathology reports and things like that. But in that case, you have to be extremely careful because the data is not usually missing at random, right? So the data is missing because maybe this practice had this type of EMR, and so that data was available, and this practice had this other type, but those are from two different, completely different things, right? Different regions, different types of clinical practice, all those things. So I don't know, at least in the field that I've worked in with like medical data or biological data, you never really get rid of it. Never throw away the data. You have to justify it, especially if you're in like a regulated environment. Like if you're working on like a clinical study, it has to be very well documented why you would throw out a data point. You know,
Thank you.
Read the Theranos book or whatever, like about like
Right.
You should not throw away data points.
For sure. I see Robert had asked a question in the chat towards the beginning of the talk, which I missed. And he said, interested in hearing how the nature of the work is different at the bigger companies you talked about, like J&J, Bristol Myers versus a smaller life science company.
Yeah, I think we have a different focus, maybe. I can speak to my own like personal experience. I think one thing at a big level is that at a big company, you have incredible access to expertise. So if you're at a big pharma company, you have medchem people who have been doing that for 20 years and they're incredible. You have commercial people who know all about how to get drugs on the market. You have people in manufacturing who know everything about that. You have lawyers. So that expertise is all there internally, and you can email them, you can find them. You know, if you're brave enough, you can get it. When you work at a small company, that expertise all exists, just not within your company. And so you have to go out and you have to get it. And I feel like that's like one of the key differences is that like, yeah, you have to do it differently that way. I think it's still all there though, right? It's not like I have to become all of a sudden an expert. I'm not going to become, you know, a medicinal chemist, but I can get a contract with a medicinal chemist to consult with me. That's maybe one big difference. The other thing would be the focus, right? We just have a slightly smaller focus, and also the need to kind of like pivot from project to project as priorities dictate is probably a little bit smaller.
Thank you. I see Jan, or apologies if I pronounced your name wrong. You had a follow-up question from the question before. Do you want to jump in?
Oh yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah, this is Jen. I tried
awesome, we can hear you.
Ask and then, sorry. Yeah. So, Alex, you just talk about how you treat the data with a record anytime that you changes, especially for those missing data. I just wonder, what was your during the project that you're, what was your the frequency of changing your missing data replaced by the mean. Is that,
Yeah.
do you often do that, or you totally not doing it by the, each cases? How do you
Yeah,
treat? Yeah.
That's a great question. I think it's always going to depend on your use case here, what you do, right? Like I've been involved in projects before where there are different methods to impute missing data, like, and a couple good R packages to do this as well. But I don't want to say the names off the top of my head in case I get them wrong. But yeah, like sometimes you do need to impute missing data. Yeah, exactly, Libby. Mice is probably one of them, right? But it depends on what you're doing, right? And whether you want to impute data or not. It depends on your use case.
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay. And then you don't have a, like estimated how often you do that, or occasionally? No. Okay.
No idea. Sorry.
So this is not like a habit you should establish, right?
Yeah, I mean, but I think it's a challenge of working with, like I said, like it really is sometimes though, you can think about different things when you're working with data, right? Like, yeah, really, the answer is always it depends. But one thing to keep in mind is sometimes we tend to think like the data comes from somewhere and now we have the data and we have to deal with it. And we can engineer this crazy complicated solution around the data or whatever. But the data didn't come from a fairy that came and said like data. Like the data came from a machine or a person or a study or something like that. And like, that's often hard that we just don't even think about that. It's like, okay, the data came and now we have the data. Well, the data didn't come from magic. Like you could go and talk and see if you can get some of that data, right? So like if it's a clinical study or something, like there's a site who put in that data and you can go and talk to them and try to get different data or rerun a plate or something if there's, a QC problem or something like that.
Right.
And I think that's like something that I personally forget all the time because I'm just so used to like, I have to over engineer a solution to my data versus trying to get better data.
I see.
I like
Yeah.
all these
You dare
comments
not
in the
to-
chat too.
Yeah.
There's some great comments in the chat about mice.
And then
Definitely.
you don't really just drop it, right? You just keep it whatever.
Depends on, I'm going to go back to it depends. It depends on your question, right? And if you
Right.
think that like you're really biasing your population a lot by removing and only looking at the patients that have that data or don't have that data, that's the question really, right?
Right.
So certainly, yeah, like sometimes you only look at a subset, like that's generally how biomarker studies work, right? If you have a large clinical study, you're not going to have biomarker data on all the patients. And that's because there wasn't a sample available. The sample didn't generate useful data. There's a lot of failure rates when you're working with biological samples. So you end up evaluating like a biomarker population versus the whole population. But the key is always to demonstrate or to evaluate how similar that population is to your larger sample, which again is not really representative of all patients, but that's the idea.
Yeah.
And it's really important because sometimes you can have a biomarker population that is skewed and somehow biased, and then it would not reflect your larger population.
Right.
Thanks,
Thank you
Alice.
so much.
Thanks for the question too. I see on Slido there's a bunch of questions coming in too, and I love this one that just came in. What leadership qualities have made the biggest mark on you, positive and or negative?
Leadership qualities?
Yes, what leadership qualities have made the biggest mark on you?
I mean, I tend to think like, I can think of good leaders that I've had in the past and what made a good leader. And so like, I apologize. I've probably sworn already like 3 times on this. So let me try to like think of a way to say it without swearing. Like the number one thing is like, don't be a jerk, right? Like there are plenty of good leaders who are complete a-holes, and there are plenty of like people who are successful who aren't. So there's got to be a choice there. And so I think like there are great leaders who really care about the people that they work with and try to do right by people, right? Like I think we've all had managers where in the past, like they've made your life miserable, but I fundamentally don't believe that people wake up in the morning and are like, I'm going to come to work and do a crappy job and I'm going to make everybody unhappy. Like it's all these other circumstances that make somebody be toxic in a work environment. But like, yeah, so leadership, it's like number one, don't be a jerk. I think the other thing is really communication. I'm a huge advocate of people communicating up and down, right? So like if you're a manager, you have to communicate a lot with your reports, but you also need to communicate a lot with your management and then your peers, and especially to advocate for your team. So I think like the leaders that I really respect are the people who are all constantly advocating for their team, right? So like I go to a lot of, like we're talking about, conferences and things, and the people who are constantly giving credit for the people who did the work, those are the kind of, I'm like, wow, they're great. I like them. Great job. When somebody doesn't have any acknowledgments or anything in their slides, I'm like, what, what's going on? Like nobody wants to work for them, right? So yeah, like people who are generous, who communicate a lot, those are kind of the leadership qualities that I tend to hone in on. Like, am I doing a good enough job communicating? I think the third thing is seeing the big picture. So that's probably kind of like some overlap there with the other two, that like sometimes people get promoted into leadership positions because they're really good at their technical work. But I think being able to see a bigger picture of how your work fits into that larger picture is very, very important. Yeah, and you don't have to be like constantly giving TED Talks and things about like your vision and like how you can see everything about the future, but being able to help connect what everybody's doing to the mission of the company or to some sort of like bigger impact is really important, because it's just very demotivating if you're working on something and you can't see how it relates to something bigger than your individual work.
That's such a good point. I always seem to notice that too in presentations when people are highlighting others on their team.
Yeah, I just feel like it's such an easy win. Like, why not be more generous? Yeah.
Definitely. I see there's quite a few packages that are being shared in the chat too. So I'm going to ask this question now. Someone asked, do you have a favorite R package?
Favorite R package ever?
I know it's a hard question.
I feel like now I should, after we were talking about that, I should be like, actually, I really like internal R packages that people have developed at companies I've worked for, right? So they're not publicly available, but people in my team at BMS developed R packages that were used in by the department, which were great, right? Because it's like, here I've identified a need and ability to help my coworkers. And so I guess what would be a publicly available R package that would be my favorite? I like all my internal R packages, but I don't know. That's a really hard one. I mean, probably if I like did an analysis of what I actually use, it's dplyr and ggplot too, right? Like everybody, like, so I guess that.
Awesome. Thank you. I'm going to go over to some other questions from Slido, but if there are questions that you all want to ask, feel free to raise your hand here on Zoom too. I see Isabella just sent me a direct message with a question, so I'll ask it. But what do you find to be the most effective way to communicate your data insights to stakeholders, especially stakeholders you might not engage with as much?
So this is where I could use help on remote work, right? Because I do think that sometimes the most effective communications I've had have been in person. And I don't have that anymore, really, usually. We don't do a lot of in-person stuff. So that's where I would love to hear how other people are doing things, because I think there are different schools of thought. Like sometimes it's like, okay, you need something interactive, so somebody could like explore and then make their own interpretations or whatever. I tend to not think that. I'm more of a fan of like the executive summary, where I'm like, here's exactly what I mean. Like no interpretation. It's like, here's the result. Because I've seen a lot of people come up with slides or presentations or something where it's like, here's a bunch of things I did. I did this. Here's a plot. I did this. Here's a table. I did this. Here's a table. And I prefer if somebody comes to the table or comes to the meeting or whatever and says, here's actually what I think you should take away from it. Like, yes, here's all the receipts. I have the plots. I have the methods. I have all that stuff. But I'm trying to convince you that this actually means this, right? Like I'm trying to convince you that we found this and it's important, or we did all this work and we need to stop doing this because it's not working, or our hypothesis was wrong or something like that. So maybe my biggest communication tip would be have a lot of like TLDRs, like executive summary, like this is the number one thing you should take away from what I'm telling you. And then here's a ton of backup. So if you want to go through and see like the nitty gritty detail, if you want to see my code, if you want to see everything, it's there. But the number one thing is like, this is what I want you to, I'm trying to persuade you of this point.
I love that. I was just writing that timestamp down to remember to go back to that. Brittany, on that topic, I see you just put a great comment into the chat too, if you'd want to expand on that.
Yeah, I think I tend to mentor a lot of analysts, more junior analysts at my company. And one thing that I notice is you can tell that someone's growing in their career when they go from this is the road I took, and then finally telling you like why you should care about all the stuff I just told you before, versus like lead with the headline and start with what people care about. And sometimes the people that you're working with will want to know how you got there, and sometimes they won't. So then you just you save yourself and them a whole lot of headache by doing it that way.
Totally. And I think that people also like, I have to say, like, I make this mistake myself all the time, right? Like I'll talk to somebody and I'll think, whoa, I messed that up. I should have been way more like short. Like I didn't need all that detail or whatever. So I think it is something that like, no matter if it's like your first day or you're like, 10,000th day, like we all kind of use reminders on that actually, because it's sometimes we default to like, I'm just going to show you what I did versus like why you should care. Yeah, totally.
I love this discussion. If other people have tips or anything you want to add as well, this is really helpful for me too. I feel like sometimes I try to fit way too much into those 30-minute meetings that you have.
Yeah. I think sometimes I go too far too, right? Like I've had a couple recently where like, I kind of assumed, I was like, they're not going to want to see the data. And then my coworkers were like, yes, they want to see the data. And then like I sent them the data and they came back with like, they actually went through everything. And I was like, oh, okay. Like I shouldn't assume that like, if somebody is an executive, they want only 2 sentences. They might actually want to see more. Yeah.
Awesome. So one other question was, I imagine this is not an issue at a startup. However, in past workplaces, have you had any challenges with colleagues misperceiving your inquisitiveness?
No, I think that's interesting though. I'm generally a very curious person. I have a lot of interests, but I think you kind of have to know when there's like a time and a place for being like talking a lot versus like not talking. And that's a great place to ask your like colleagues and stuff for feedback, right? Like to be like, okay, like, is it just me, or, was I the only one talking in that meeting? Like, or things like that. No, I can't think of a time, to be honest, where it was necessarily like misinterpreted. I think I've been very fortunate to work in research settings where curiosity is rewarded, and people are also very accepting of you asking questions, right? Like I'm not afraid to, if I don't know something, I'll ask. And I think that's always been, I actually respect that a lot in people. So it's maybe back to like the leadership question, right? It's people who know what they know and kind of like are comfortable with what they don't know. So, if you don't know something in a meeting, I'm happy to ask about it, even if it's something that's really basic for somebody else. Like if I don't know it, that's fine. And I really respect that in leaders that I've seen who will say like, you know what, I have no idea what precision means. So like, you're going to have to explain it to me.
Yeah, that's a great point. I know an hour is going by very quickly. But I know when we first met, actually, I think it was on the R Ladies Slack and then a discussion, we talked a little bit about like a role that you were hiring for and your thoughts around hiring. I just was curious, are you still hiring now? Or?
I am. And I think that is also another difference between like a big company and a small company, is that at a big company, you kind of have a lot of baggage maybe that like people know about the company. So that can be a huge incentive because they're like, oh, great, look at this like great company. It's a big company. I want to work there. And so you get a lot of like the work done for you of explaining the company. So when I've been hiring for my new job, at least until recently, we didn't have a website. We had 3 employees. And so I had to work a lot within my network to be like, okay, let me explain to you, like, please just give me an opening. And then now, like, since you know nothing about the company, I'm going to have to explain it to you a lot more than I had to in the past, when it was like, have you heard of Johnson and Johnson? Like, people kind of know it, and they're not as, there's less work there to do that. But I would actually love, I don't know if we have time yet for people to talk about if they've had any particularly like positive or negative remote hiring experiences, because that's been something I've been kind of experimenting with, is how do I make an interview a good experience for a candidate? Because at the end of the day, I'm trying to sell them. I'm like, come work with us. Like, I want you to be excited about coming to this job. So I don't want the interview to be like too long, but I also don't want it to be too short, because then they're not going to know enough about the job to like come and do it. So I would love to hear if people have tips or like particularly good, or even like particular nightmare. Like, I would love to hear like a hiring nightmare situation so that I can never do that. Yeah, because hiring remote is definitely, it creates new challenges. I see a hand
Javier,
raised.
yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, just in terms of the nightmare situation, this was years ago, about 10 years ago, but we hired someone. This was before I got into the way I'm using R today and Python and whatnot, but we were giving Excel technical interviews, and we were telling all the candidates in advance, we're going to be doing Excel technical interviews. And this one individual like blew it out of the park. It turns out that they must have like really, really studied for the basics that we were looking for. Since then, I have had way more success not giving that kind of technical interview. And literally the technical interview is more of a discussion. I would much rather prefer hiring someone if I ask them like, hey, you know how to develop Shiny apps. I'd much rather someone tell me, I've never developed a Shiny app in my life, but I use R Markdown every day. Or, you know, like that tells me a lot about their ability to actually jump in and learn something new, and like just their transparency. So I feel like the types of technical interviews I've had a lot of success with the last few years has been more like, almost more like a discussion technical interview, where I'm not even asking them to whiteboard anything, or it's just talking.
Yeah. No, I love that. And that's what I'm trying to get at. Like, if you have any good questions that you ask in those like technical interview discussions or something, I would love to hear them. Because that's what I'm kind of working on. I have this like evolving list of like interview questions and how we ask them to try to get at some of these things, right? Because in some ways I'm much more interested in the process, right? Like how do people approach a problem and solve challenges that they encounter versus the specific project they worked on, because you know they're not going to work on that project ever again with me. It's going to be a new project, so they're going to have to learn something anyway.
For sure.
Yeah.
I've had like the last few roles I've placed have been exclusively from R related things, whether it's meetups or R hackathons, or it's people I've met. To the point where I'm starting to feel like I need to make more of an effort to get into like a Python related hackathon or a Python conference or something, you know, where I might be like over indexing on R folks. But seeing these people at hackathons and the way they just problem solve, you know, in like a day or 4 hours of seeing how someone thinks, you really get a lot of insight about these individuals. I don't know, just some tips that have worked for me.
That's awesome.
Thank you. Brittany, I see you have your hand raised too. You want to jump in?
Yeah, my company actually does. We do a technical interview, and we give candidates a data set while they're sort of on site, whether that's them actually being on site or just being in like a Teams meeting. And then we give them maybe like an hour and a half to actually just see what sorts of insights you find with a few very specifically directed questions. And what we're often looking for is not someone to have perfect answers to those questions. Kind of like what you said, it's really about understanding how did you look at the data set? what other information did you want? What do you wish you had been like had more time to do? So you really get to see, like Javier said, how people are thinking, how they work through something. And it's okay if they don't have like a perfectly polished presentation after like 45 minutes or so.
That's great, Brittany. I was just trying to read through some of the other comments in the chat too. George, did I see your hand was raised earlier?
Yeah, briefly.
Okay.
So I had I guess it was part of an interview that covered both technical and soft. This was pre-pandemic, and that was on site, but it was R-based questions, and it went horrifically. But they gave me the job in the end. But the bit which was absolutely horrible, and I like still get cold sweats thinking about it. Like I just sort of froze in the interview. It became like a pub quiz on our stuff, and that is like categorically my worst nightmare of it. It was like, what packages are in the tidyverse? Like and at the time I didn't use tidyverse. I was base R, and so I ended up going on site and getting a job and learning tidyverse really well and loving it. But so this was like 4 or 5 years ago. Oh, I can't remember. 2018. And yeah, it was just, that sort of like, what package would you use to do this? What function would you use? I'm like, I have no idea. I can't answer this question. So that was horrible.
I feel like one that sticks in my head from an interview I did was they were like, please describe in detail the differences between Python 3 and Python 2. I was like,
oh.
I know that they both exist, right? Like, is that an answer?
There's non-backward compatible changes.
Print, maybe?
F printing? Like, I feel like it's one thing I could think of. F printing, is it?
I kind of said, like, honestly, I'm not going to answer that question.
Have you ever answered anything with, this is something I would Google? Because I feel like that's a valid answer sometimes. It's like, I don't know this, but I know where to find it. So like, I feel really confident in my ability to Google this. I feel like it's a valid response for me. Googling is a skill.
Yeah.
Honestly, if I asked somebody a question and they said that, they were like, you know what, this is something that I know where I could find the answer to that, I would be like, perfect answer. Like, that's a perfect answer to me. Like, not knowing, but knowing where to find the information. Great.
Absolutely. Ravonda, I see you have your hand raised too.
Yes, I was just going to say that I liked Brittany's idea on a technical interview. I was just personally, similar to Alice and some others, I'd been getting questions that you could just go on Google or find something like that, very technical. And I also, because of my field, I went probably like 5 or 6 years ago, I went on 3 different interviews, and they had a technical part on algorithms. In every single one of them, the answer was dynamic programming. So they must have gone somewhere and decided that that was the algorithm to ask about. And I find that a little bit ridiculous because it wasn't really relevant to what they were working on. And I got to the point where I found that was a little bit off-putting. So whenever I interview people, I try to make it more like Brittany does, which is more of a conversation around the data and what we might actually be doing. Because you can Google things, you can learn things. It's more about problem solving.
Yeah. So that is, I have been doing that a little bit. So I have an optional take home, which is that it's like, here's a data set, take an hour and tell me something. Use whatever tools you want. Use Excel, use R, use Python, use, an abacus. And just the key thing I want to see is I want to see some sort of like written output of like what you did and what you would do if you had more time. So I'm still kind of on the fence though, because I know that a lot of people are like so anti having like any kind of technical component that I'm still trying to feel out like, okay, net, is it better to have it or better not to have it? Like, is it really helping us make the best hiring decisions? But I do love that format. Like, I think what you described is awesome.
Mark says style points if they use an abacus though.
Right? Yeah. Like, honestly, right? If somebody came with like some crazy creative thing where they were like, I did something, I don't know, maybe it would be a pro.
I know we're a little bit over the top of the hour, so I just want to make sure there weren't questions that I missed either on, and yeah, Libby, an hour is never enough, but questions I missed on Slido or anything in the chat, feel free to raise your hand. And Alice, while people are thinking of last questions, or if they had any, what's the best way for people to stay in touch with you?
Oh yeah, I think probably LinkedIn. I'm on LinkedIn. I'm also on Twitter. My handle is Science Alice. So you can follow me on Twitter for the 5 times a year I tweet something. Yeah, but like LinkedIn or Twitter are great. Yeah, and I would love to hear people, like, honestly, I would love to hear people's interview ideas, especially for like remote hiring, great things that they're doing that they think have worked really well, or places that they're finding are really great for hiring. Would love it if you reach out to me on that sort of thing.
I was just thinking back to one of the data science hangouts. I think the last one of last year, we were talking about hiring in Great Deal. And I'm bad at multitasking, but I was trying to find it at the same time.
Yeah.
Let me just grab it real quick. Unless Tyler or Hannah, you can share the one from Ryan Garnett. Okay, it might start playing on YouTube when I click on this, so apologies. Okay, I got it. I always hate when the YouTube videos start with my own voice and I have to listen to my voice there. But I just shared that.
Awesome.
I think it would be helpful for everyone too. But thank you so much, Alice. This was awesome.
Yeah,
Really,
thank you. I mean, I had a lot of fun, so.
Really appreciate you sharing your experience with us. And thank you for all the great questions too. I'll see everybody next week, hopefully. We will be joined by Travis Skirk from the prostate clinical research trials. Awesome. Thanks, everyone. Have a great rest of the day.